unimaginable.
911, what is your emergency?
The emergency is we just witnessed, we think, a murder.
It was more than just a murder case. It was a stalking case.
3 stories of America's most dangerous stalkers.
Stalking is to chase, to seek, to pursue.
The man who terrorized famed film director Steven Spielberg.
Stalkers are very much like cats. They're predators.
The man who hunted actress Jerry Ryan.
It's a crime of mental terrorism.
And the man who played a deadly game of cat and mouse with his wife.
She was afraid that he was going to kill her and the kids and dump them in the desert.
See what it takes to catch the stalkers. Rhonda Saunders, passionate prosecutor and deputy district attorney for Los Angeles County. Because of her, groundbreaking new laws have been passed and replicated worldwide.
The route guidance will start now.
Since 1990, Rhonda's been on a mission to make California stalkers pay for their crimes before it's too late.
I get my cases in many ways. A lot of times police agencies will call me directly, or I'll get a call from the studios, or I'll get a call from a private security company that there's a stalking case. I've been able to do legislation. I've been able to make laws, stalking laws, threat laws.
Based near the movie studios, Rhonda's prosecuted stalking cases involving some of Hollywood's biggest stars.
Some of the famous cases that I've done: Steven Spielberg, Madonna, Gwyneth Paltrow, Eric Garris, Tori Spelling. I've prosecuted in the hundreds of stalking and cases, but I've handled over 1,000.
But up until 1990, stalking wasn't even recognized as a crime. It took a shocking murder by this man to grab the attention of the legislators. The victim was a 21-year-old television star.
Rebecca Schaeffer was a young actress who played the ingenue lead in a TV show called My Sister Sam, and she was just starting her career. It was just taking off when she was brutally murdered by Robert Bardo.
For 2 years, the teenage fast food worker nursed an obsession for Rebecca Schaeffer. 3 times, he traveled from Tucson, Arizona to Los Angeles to try to meet with her. 3 times, studio security turned him away.
And then he went to the movies to see her in her first adult role. She was playing a bedroom scene with an actor. And to him, this was a complete betrayal. How dare she? This pure young thing that he idolized was in bed with this man. And he decided that he had to save her from herself. He got on the bus with a gun and hollow point bullets. And his intent was to find her and kill her. Bardo showed up, rang her doorbell, and surprise, she answered. She didn't have a chance to say anything, and he shot her once through the heart.
Later, for his trial, Bardo gave a chilling account of his crime.
Here is this young, promising actress laying on the ground in a pool of blood, looking up at him going, why? Why?
Bardo was found guilty of first-degree murder, and in December '91 was sentenced to life without parole. His crime was a wake-up call that forced California's lawmakers to pass unprecedented legislation that outlawed stalking. It was also the case that set Rhonda on a crusade.
Before that, people were dying, people were getting raped, people were getting killed by stalkers, only we didn't have a name for it. We didn't have a statute against it. So in 1991, California passed the very first stalking law in the world.
Ms. Saunders, you have asked that this motion be counted.
And every year since, Rhonda Saunders has lobbied for ever tighter stalking laws.
The elements that we have to show to prove stalking is that the stalker repeatedly followed or harassed the victim. And harassing could be anything from sending unwanted flowers, sending dead flowers, leaving a 9mm bullet on the doorstep of someone's apartment. It's a series of acts that place a victim in fear, in horror, in terror. It's a crime of mental terrorism. How do you now plead to the charge that on or about May 12, 2001, that you committed the crime of stalking in violation of Penal Code Section 646.9? Does counsel join? Thank you.
Rhonda Saunders hasn't always been a prosecutor. Born in the Bronx, she started out as an actress. Now established in LA, her services are sought out by some of the richest and most famous people on the planet.
With celebrity stalkers, a lot of times they're seeking that notoriety. The stalker who killed John Lennon, the stalker who killed Rebecca Schaeffer. They gloried in the fact that they'd pick up a paper while they were in prison and they'd see their picture next to the star, that their name will forever go down in history with that of the celebrity. Celebrity stalkers, though, can be very difficult to prosecute because people think, oh, this case got filed because of who the victim is. And that's not true. Victim is a victim.
And in the summer of 1997, Hollywood's most successful director found himself the victim of a fanatical stalker. Jonathan Norman was a 30-year-old model who drifted from job to job and lover to lover. Fresh out of prison for criminal battery and violent assault, Norman now had his sights trained on Steven Spielberg.
We don't know why he focused on Steven Spielberg, but while he was in prison for other crimes, somehow he became enamored with Steven Spielberg and started collecting articles about him. When he got out of prison, he went on the internet and got all kinds of information about Spielberg. He bought one of those star maps that you see being sold in Beverly Hills for $7 and found out where Spielberg actually lived.
Next, Norman launches a twisted campaign of terror that would test the limits of the stalking law.
Tonight at 11, Court TV's Nancy Grace goes inside the Scott Peterson trial.
Jonathan Norman was a drifter, a convicted batterer, and now it seemed a bold stalker. Armed with Steven Spielberg's home address, he spent weeks staking out the film director's heavily fortified mansion. He purchased night vision goggles from a store in Hollywood, but still could find no way in.
So what did he do? He went to a car rental place, and he had to actually order a car that was identical to Steven Spielberg's wife's car. The same year, the same model, the same color. And he was hoping that he could just drive up to the gate, the guard wouldn't look inside, would think it was Spielberg's wife, and open the gate, and he'd be home free.
But this ploy also failed. Undeterred, at 1 o'clock in the morning on July 11th, Norman returned. This time, he was caught on Spielberg's security cameras.
He parked his Rover right in front of Spielberg's house. That's the security guard approaching his car. And then he approaches Norman. You could actually see Norman in the car. You see him? Right there. The security guard has approached him to ask him what the heck he's doing there. And he gave the security guard some story about, oh, my car broke down. But the security guard realized that the engine was running, there was nothing wrong with his car, and told him to move on.
By 7 a.m., Norman was back again. Spielberg's security team contacted the LAPD's stalking unit. Detective Jeff Dunn took the call.
Well, I was a supervising detective of the threat management unit at the time, and the call came out from West Tech security agents that there was a person trespassing in the area around Mr. Spielberg's home.
Norman had been found running through neighbors' backyards, brandishing a 5-foot stick.
Initial contact with Mr. Norman was to hospitalize him under Health and Welfare and Safety Code Section 5150 so that he could be evaluated and assessed as to his dangerousness to himself or his dangerousness to somebody else.
But 3 hours later, Norman was released, assessed as nothing more than an obsessive fan. No one realized how dangerous he really was.
In retrospect, Mr. Norman was a very dangerous individual. He had a very violent criminal past. He was delusional to the point that he thought that transmitters had been planted in his head and that Mr. Spielberg was possibly communicating with him through these transmitters.
Back home, Norman was preparing to strike again. Undeterred by his encounter with the police, he gathered together his arsenal of weapons. By 5 p.m., for the third time that day, he was back at Spielberg's mansion.
You see Norman backing his car up, and at one point he backs his car right into the gate that leads to Spielberg's house, as if he's trying to break the gate down. There it is, right there. And he doesn't just stop. He tries, and then he backs it up some more. Right now, he's touching the gate. He backs up again. You see him? Trying to break down the gate. So he was preparing to launch the assault on Spielberg's house at this point. Eventually, he takes it sort of like a little sunscreen, and he puts it over the front of his windshield so that nobody can see in. Finally, the police get there, and they immediately grab him, and they do a pat down, and that's when they feel this huge roll of duct tape under his shirt, and they remove it, and they find this set of handcuffs that he has attached through the hole in the duct tape. And then they do another pat down and find his razor blade knife.
For the second time in 24 hours, Norman was in custody. Despite the menacing items seized from him, it was decided again that Norman wasn't dangerous. He was released without charge.
Everybody thought that Norman was crazy. However, I looked at the way he had planned his attack. All right, there may be some mental illness there, but he still knew exactly what he was doing.
Rhonda was convinced that Norman was dangerous and wanted to prosecute him under the stalking law. But to do it, she needed evidence. Her break came from a surprising source.
We had interviewed Norman's lover, Chuck Markovich, and he had said that he was planning to go over to Jonathan Norman's apartment and clean it out. Well, we knew there had to be evidence there, and I tried to get a search warrant done, and nothing was happening.
Rhonda headed downtown to call on an old associate, Detective Pat McPherson, head of an elite team of DA investigators.
The Deputy District Attorney, Rhonda Saunders, came to the Major Crimes Unit early in the morning on a Monday and requested an investigator be assigned immediately. When we're dealing with a case of this magnitude, we try to move on them as rapidly as we can because evidence can't get away, and in this case, it nearly did.
Pat McPherson, who to this day I say saved our case for us.
Being the lead investigator, I sent investigators out to check several locations, and then I drafted a search warrant to serve on Jonathan Norman's apartment.
But by the time they got there, the apartment was completely cleaned out.
At that point, I found out where Chuck Markovich was living at the time, which was in Hollywood, and we changed the focus of our investigation and our search warrant to Chuck Markovich's apartment. In the living room area where the bed was, he had actually set out piles of evidence that we later seized, which Chuck Markovich was actually going to destroy. Also, we found a journal that chronicled the efforts made by Jonathan to do surveillance on Steven Spielberg to the point where he was going to try to invade Steven Spielberg's home.
Part of the evidence they found there was Norman's diary with the blueprint for how he was going to rape Spielberg, lots of other evidence, things from a spy shop that he had visited, the information on Spielberg, all of these things that we used at trial, even the receipt for the handcuffs. And if those investigators had been one day late, we wouldn't have had the case that we had.
Next, Steven Spielberg comes face to face with his stalker.
Tonight at 11, Court TV's Nancy Grace.
The trial date was set for Steven Spielberg's fanatical stalker. Rhonda Saunders had now amassed a powerful body of evidence to prosecute Jonathan Norman.
This was his master plan, to attack Spielberg, how to get to Spielberg. I would force him to put on a screaming muzzle, and the screaming muzzle, part of the evidence that we found on him was this huge roll of duct tape, very wide duct tape. And during the trial, Spielberg even testified that it was obvious to him what he was going to use that duct tape for, and that was to place it over his mouth so that he wouldn't be able to scream while Norman was doing whatever he had planned to do.
With Spielberg as the victim, it was clear the trial would come under intense media scrutiny. But Rhonda was prepared.
We went to the grand jury, and they keep everything confidential. So we were able to seal the records in this case up until about a month before the trial itself. When the records were unsealed, the first thing that happened was the entire transcript of the grand jury hearing was put out on the internet. Now, how do you get a fair jury? Everyone had heard about the case, but I had to kick off anyone who had read the transcript on the internet because they could prejudge the case. It just created a lot of difficulties.
Norman was finally brought to trial in the summer of '98, and the world watched as the press pack descended.
It was outside Spielberg's expansive Los Angeles estate where Norman was arrested last summer. Police say he was trying to get into the home armed with handcuffs, duct tape, and a knife. Norman's defense attorney claims his client was on drugs and is mentally ill.
Even if he had taken some drugs.
As the trial began, Rhonda found herself fighting the case both in and out of court.
This is a crime that was planned over a period of many weeks. He did the research. He actually went out and purchased these items. The thought was there.
But Norman's attorneys had a powerful defense. All the time Norman had been stalking Spielberg, the director was out of the country. The stalking law had no precedent for someone being stalked when he wasn't physically there.
Mr. Spielberg was out of country, filming, I believe it was Saving Private Ryan, and he was in Europe. He wasn't present when this was going on. He wasn't informed until after the fact that this individual was trying to approach him and confront him at his residence. And so we had a little bit of a problem with the fear element, and there was a little bit of problem with the credible threat when you're dealing with a victim that's several thousand miles away.
And my theory was that the defendant didn't know Spielberg was in England and Ireland. He thought that Spielberg and his family were right there. That's why he was trying so hard to get into the house. Well, that was the criminal intent. You go to the criminal's mind of what he planned to do. And when Spielberg did find out, he was terrified.
To convince the jury, Rhonda called in Spielberg himself as a witness.
Spielberg was wonderful, made himself available to be interviewed several times when I needed to talk to him about the case. He was supposed to do the background music for Saving Private Ryan, and he oversaw everything. And he had the whole Philharmonic lined up to do the music for it. And it just so happened that that was the day that I needed him for the trial. And he canceled the Philharmonic so that he could be in court.
Mr. Spielberg, do you have any comments?
Spielberg's testimony would be crucial if Rhonda was to prove that Norman posed a real threat, even though Spielberg hadn't been home.
He said that he tried to be a good person all of his life. He tried to help other people all of his life. And it never dawned on him that there would be somebody out there who would want to harm him, or harm his children, or harm his wife. And now his life was changed because he realized that there were people like Jonathan Norman out there.
In a stunning courtroom victory, Norman was convicted of stalking. Not only had Rhonda won her case, she'd also set another new and important legal precedent.
Our stalking laws have evolved every year pretty much since the year 1990. And Rhonda has drafted a lot of language for legislation to support those stalking laws and stalking enhancement. And we've probably got about the most user-friendly stalking law in California out of any of the other 50 states. And largely because Rhonda Saunders is such an active proponent for stalking laws and stalking prosecution.
Despite the gravity of his crime, Norman was facing no more than a couple of years in prison. But Rhonda had a final trick up her sleeve. Norman had 2 previous convictions for criminal battery and violent assault, which under California's 3-strike law could add decades to his sentence.
If Jonathan Norman didn't have those 2 strikes, despite the fact that he had laid out this plan for rape, he had the handcuffs, had the knife, had the duct tape, and everything else, if he didn't have those 2 strikes and he was convicted of stalking, he would have been out of prison in a 1.5 years. Pretty much he would have walked out the door. And where do you think he would have gone? Fortunately, we did have the 3 strikes. So instead of walking out the door, he was sentenced to 25 years to life.